So, why do we only have two parties? Other countries have tons of parties. Why do we only have two? This is the perennial question because you look back and historically, there have always been two major parties. We have, we have individual elections where you will have a bunch of other parties, and any given election, you've probably got other candidates out there, but really there's always two major ones. Why is that? What is it about America that we only seem to be able to get a new party when one of the existing parties fails? You get a new party, you get the Whig Party, but only because the Federalists had ceased to be. And why? Why is that? That instead of third parties rising up and just then having three, why do we only have two? I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer, but we can look at several of the factors that contribute to that. We've had a two-party system for all but about 30 years. And a good chunk of that was that system where it was really the Federalist, between when the Federalists fell out and before the Democratic Republicans split into the Democrats and the Whigs. A third party is any party that is organized in opposition or as an alternative to the two-party system. So even though there may be more than three, any besides the two main ones are called third parties. So the current third parties, you usually have a Libertarian candidate, maybe a Green Party candidate. In some states, you might have a Socialist Party candidate. But they're all called third parties, even if they're more than three. So one reason why we tend to keep two is that a lot of the way that the issues come up, they are two-sided. You're either for it or against it. You've got a policy, and you're either for this solution or you're against this solution. It's not. That's the way the debate tends to happen, and that is still going on. So the debate on immigration continues to provide. It's still, you're either for building a wall or you're against building the wall, even though you can imagine that immigration is a multifaceted, complicated problem that you might have more than two solutions, yet the debate tends to get framed in that for it or against it, two-sided, dualist mode. Most U.S. elections are winner-take-all. That means the candidate with the most votes wins. It does not necessarily mean that that candidate has a majority of the votes. It's called a plurality system, and if you've got more than two candidates, then it is certainly possible and even likely that nobody's going to win 50% plus one. But rather than having a runoff election, and runoffs until you get somebody with a majority, in most U.S. elections, we have whoever gets the plurality of the votes, whether it is a majority or not, wins. This also applies in the Electoral College. All states except Maine and Nebraska have a winner-take-all system, and they do that in order to make themselves more important to the candidates. To get more attention to local issues and to get a candidate to fight for your votes. Because especially if you're a big state, you've got a lot of electoral votes, then you become a really prized target. But it also means that if a big state, if a state is consistently going for one party or the other, the party that is less favored might not even bother to campaign there at all. So it can backfire a little. You might get no attention at all if you're a solidly Democratic state or a solidly Republican state. The parties may just take you for granted and not bother to campaign at all because they know they're going to get all your electoral votes anyway. And that is why you get this phenomenon in U.S. elections where you get the battleground states, the states that are close enough that either candidate might win them and that have enough electoral votes to shift the victory one way or the other. Those are the ones that the candidates fight for. There are alternatives. We could go with a majoritarian voting system. That would require that you get a majority of the votes before you win. And so that would mean you'd have to have runoff elections if no candidate got a majority. That would give more space, more power to third parties, because even if you were not capable of winning the majority, you might get enough votes that the other candidates need your votes in order to get the majority they need. So that gives that third party some negotiating room to say, okay, who can I work with here, and which of my policies will you promise to try to enact if I support you in the runoff election? So a majoritarian voting scheme would give third parties more power. The other possibility is a proportional representation model, where political parties win seats equal to the percentage of the vote that they get. So even if you don't win a whole state, a third party might still win a few electors. And if you have something close in the electoral college, then that third party, again, that gives them some negotiating power to get some concessions from whoever eventually does win, to make the other parties take their issues seriously. So far, the United States is resisting those, but these are things that other countries do and that we could do, that would be alternatives that would create more space for third parties to be viable and to be able to actually deliver something to people, that saying that voting for a third party wouldn't be just, as they say, throwing your vote away. There are also a number of election laws that reinforce the two-party system, and that is because we have had a two-party system. The two parties have been running the federal and state governments, and so they write laws that support their continuing to be in power. They do things like the two major parties often automatically get put on the ballots for any elections. It's just assumed they're going to have a nominee because they're the established parties, whereas third parties have to meet special deadlines. Sometimes you have to get a large number of signatures on a petition to even get a name on the ballot before you can even start campaigning for somebody. So just getting on the ballot is often a serious barrier to third parties that the established two parties do not have to face. You also have what has come to be called gerrymandering, and this is the map that gave gerrymandering its name. It's not new. This is from 1812, and gerrymandering is where the parties will deliberately draw voting districts to try to either to favor or disfavor one party. So they will, whichever party has control of the government, the state government, or whichever party is controlling the government that has control over redistricting, which is usually the state legislature, will deliberately draw districts so that they concentrate votes just enough to have a majority and distribute the opposition, dilute them out amongst, so that they maximize. Or they might make, one district really heavily of the opposition, so that, you just really win that district overwhelmingly, but we win the 3 districts around it. So the first time this really, it probably wasn't the first time it happened, but it was really egregious and got a lot of attention and came up with the name gerrymandering, was in 1812 when the Massachusetts legislature drew this district that a lot of people thought looked a lot like a salamander. And it was done in order to try to ensure the re-election of the sitting governor, Elbridge Gerry, and so it was called Gerry's Mander. the gerrymander, and that's where we get the word gerrymandering. And I have personal experience with this. When I was in grad school, my school was in a district that the campus was this little island connected to a district on the other side of town, so that the neighborhood around the college would would vote a different way, and we would be lumped in to another district. And to connect the campus, the district actually went down the freeway so as not to pick up anybody who was living on either side. It was really ridiculous. I've seen districts that reach out over bodies of water to grab a little pocket of voters to make sure they get pulled into a part of a district. There's a lot of movement attempts to try to stop this practice, but trying to come up with rational districts. There's a lot of issues around that because, well, what makes it rational? What is it you're trying to maximize something? Are you trying to maximize coherent geometric shapes? Is it about geometry? Is it about you want the representation to mirror the demographic representation of the constituents? You're trying to maximize something. What are you trying to maximize? And those things don't always align. So any system, you're going to be gaming it for something. It's a question of what is it that you think is more fair to game it for, rather than maximizing returns for one political party or the other. Both parties do this, by the way. This is not the domain of one party or the other. Both parties totally do this. So one of the most significant obstacles to having a third party be successful, even though there's a lot of people an increasing number of people who are identifying themselves as independent precisely because they say neither party represents me. The problem is that all of those people differ from one another. It's not that they all disagree with the established parties for the same reason. So there's not something for them to coalesce around. You've got that, 40% or so of independents in the middle that would be a sizable party if you could find something for them to coalesce around other than, I just don't like the other two. But in fact, they fall across the ideological spectrum. And so it's not an obvious place to form another party. About 60% of Americans say they think a third party is needed, but they can't agree on what they think that third party should be or what it should stand for. But third parties have and continue to play an influential role, even though they don't get elected very often. Just the threat of forming a third party is sometimes enough. That is actually something that Donald Trump threatened to do. If he wasn't nominated by the Republicans, he was going to run as an independent, and they thought he might pull enough votes that it would split the Republican vote. And that is what usually happens with third parties, is they end up splitting the vote of the party they are closest to, allowing the party they disagree with most to win. So this sometimes discourages people from voting for third parties, and allows candidates that have significant personal followings to have a lot of leverage against the existing parties. Just the threat of forming a third party can be enough to get the party to move in a direction that it might not otherwise have moved. You can categorize third parties into basically three general categories. There are issue parties, that people who've coalesced around an issue, like the Green Party around conservation and environmental issues. Or you have ideologically oriented parties. These might be a little bit broader, but they have a different ideological focus than the two existing parties. Examples of this would be like the Libertarian Party and the Socialist Party. Or you have splinter parties. This is where you have some disaffected group of one of the existing parties, that does split off. That is what happened when Teddy Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party. And for a while, the Dixiecrats weren't just the Southern contingent of the Democratic Party. They formed a third party for a while. So those are both splinter parties, and historically, the effect of splinter parties has been that they actually allow the party they disagree with the most to win because they end up splitting the vote. However, that doesn't mean third parties don't have impacts. So, in addition to splitting the vote, which some people think that's what Ralph Nader did in 2000, that he cost Al Gore the election by splitting the vote. Third parties, they do provide a release valve for disaffected voters, gives people a protest vote, and that does send a signal to the big parties that there's issues out here that aren't being met. There are constituents here that, can you find a way within your political platform, or sometimes the metaphor used is under the tent, under the party tent. Can you find room in your party tent to bring these disaffected voters in? It's an opportunity, and in that way, a third party can, if it gets some traction, can get one of the major parties to pay attention to issues that, by letting them know there's a significant number of people that are willing to vote for it. So it brings national attention to a variety of issues.